Hello, everybody, and I'd like to welcome everybody here and also on Zoom to this seminar in the Law and Humanities seminar series of Peking University School of Transnational Law. We sometimes call ourselves STL for short, S School, T Transnational, L Law, STL, 北京大学国际法学院. My name is Norman Ho, and I teach here at the law school. It's my great pleasure to welcome our speaker and presenter for today, Dr. Brian Wang, who serves as Assistant Professor of Philosophy at the University of Hong Kong. Brian's research interests span political philosophy, moral philosophy, geopolitics, and foreign policy. He's written widely in these areas. He also serves as fellow at the Center for Contemporary China and the World at the University of Hong Kong. In addition to his academic work in philosophy, Brian is a prolific commentator on Sino-US relations, US-Sino relations, foreign policy, and geopolitics. His articles and writings on foreign policy have been published in periodicals such as Time Magazine, SCMP, Financial Times, and also the Hong Kong Economic Journal. And Brian received his DPhil from Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. And I should also just point out that his other work includes working with youth, especially in Hong Kong. And by youth, I mean also middle and high school students, giving them advice. And he's involved deeply in youth initiatives as well in Hong Kong, where he's from. Brian will be speaking to us today on the topic of Towards a Confucian Ethics Governing Human-AI Relations. He will speak for about 40 minutes, after which we'll open the floor to questions both online and in person. I would like to give the floor now to Dr. Brian Wang. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Norman. And just wanted to check, for those of you online, could you indicate that you can hear me clearly? Because the last thing I want is to be speaking into the void. Well, not the void. Okay. Jolly good. Brilliant. Fantastic. Great to see you, Francis. Lovely to meet you for the first time, and hopefully not the last time. So thank you very much. I want to speak really about the application and also the imagination of where Confucian theory intersects the relationship between humans and AI. But before I really launch into the meat of the argument, I want to just start by asking myself and all of us here, why are we interested? And what got me interested in this question? You know, for a very long while, we've seen essentially Confucian ethics studied as a historical sort of component of intellectual history, where you'd have folks either undertaking very much individual-centered investigations into what, say, Shun, Mengzi, Confucius, Kongzi said and thought, and you sought to reconstruct their arguments through lenses of historical investigations and inquiries. Alternatively, there is, to some extent, an attempt to apply Confucian ethical principles to more nascent problems, but not really to the extent that it straddles or encompasses technological ethics and uniquely, 21st century problems such as those intersecting digital interfaces, advent of nascent technologies, and of course, blockchain and AI as well. So it is against this context and backdrop that the past few years of evolution and what I call neo or new Confucian thinking, to differentiate this from Neo-Confucianism, has seen the rise of folks looking at really where Confucian thought can be drawn upon to inspire better and more informed inquiries into what we ought to do in relation to technology within East Asian context, but also across the world at large. And here I'm inspired by the works of Daniel Bell, a friend and a colleague of mine at HKU, who's written, or offered a few attempts on trying to connect Confucian theory and theories of hierarchy, just hierarchies, with human and AI interactions. I'm also inspired by Wong Hang's work on technological ethics rooted in, again, Confucian principles and ideals, which is an effort and an endeavor that's echoed by Song Bing's edited volume in 2021 on, again, Chinese perspectives on AI. But of course, for those of you listening here, you would be skeptical somewhat, or you might be skeptical somewhat, which is to say, what do you mean by Confucian ethics governing human-AI relations? There are many aspects and components of Confucian thought that we could draw upon. I mean, how could we determine the most fitting and optimal, theories to apply and the levers to draw upon here? And that is where I would like to just highlight very clearly my key thesis and the focus of today's talk. And a very clear caveat prefaces that, which is to say, I'm by no means suggesting that my chapter or my work, which I have submitted and will actually come out in a DAO companion to applied Confucian ethics next year, I by no means suggest and imply that my work encompasses all there is in Confucian thought that can be applied to AI. What I'm instead positing here is that we look at a particular segment of Confucian thought, and that is love with distinction. Okay, the idea of aiwu, qinqin, renmin, aiwu. That particular lexical ordering, which I'll explain shortly, is a very useful adage that we can draw upon to help us understand how we as human beings ought to relate to different modes and different forms of AI as a whole. And the ultimate summary of this all is that whilst there are seemingly three components to qinqin, renmin, aiwu relationship, they all come together in a holistic fashion in underpinning how humanity ought to see and view AI based on their distinctive features and also the different modes by which we can relate with them, so to speak. It sounds a bit cryptic, but I promise you it will become clearer in around 20 minutes' time. Okay, so that's the introduction. Now it behoves me to lay out a few definitions before moving on to the meat. Firstly, on AI, I take artificial intelligence to refer to essentially the ability of entities to engage in goal-directed adaptive behavior, or more idiosyncratically, as we use AI in our day-to-day conversation, AI refers to specific agents, models, and frameworks developed within the field of mechanical AI science that is capable of possessing the said ability identified just then. So obviously, whilst AI in theory refers to an ability, it has in practice become a shorthand, in a way we use it in ordinary discourse for the agents and models and also frameworks that can perform the very much aforementioned goal-directed adaptive behavior. And this is not to say I agree with this being a rigorous definition of AI. It's just to say that we do use it quite a lot in ordinary contexts as such. And for the sake of clarity, there are times I might interchange between these two definitions of AI in my lecture. If you don't like that, please do let me know. But otherwise, I hope you understand what I'm saying at times. This AI agent, right? What am I saying there? What am I referring to? That's essentially what I'm talking about here when I say an AI agent. Furthermore, just a quick overview again of the literature that exists. As it stands, a lot of the normative approaches to thinking about the moral and political status of AI have tended to adopt three distinctive approaches. The first being a rights-centered account, thinking about AI as rights-holding entities, that might have claims over us or power rights, so to speak, to borrow from the Hegelian typology and nomenclature. The second sort of framework is more consequentialist. It says we should look at AI through lenses of, essentially whatever optimizes and maximizes the best consequences, and you then plug in whatever theory of the good, whether it be hedonistic, pluralist, so on and so forth, to make that consequentialist ethical framework work. And finally, of course, there's the Kantian approach that says, well, let's ask ourselves, can we see AI agents as Kantian agents that meet the minimal requirements and thresholds, okay, that is needed for them to count in our sort of kingdom, okay, of ends, okay, this universalization paradigm that we use as a matrix within Kantian ethics to help us figure out what we owe towards one another and what are the maxims that we ought to adopt categorically or reject because they do not fit, the universalization requirements of Kantian ethics. My submission is all of these are interesting approaches that we have no time to go into detail in examining and comparing against, at least in my primary lecture. But I do think what's neglected thus, in these mainstream discourses is the possibility of applying and drawing upon Confucian theory and rendering that relevant and germane to the field of AI ethics. Now, the various books and chapters and volumes I mentioned just then are nascent attempts in so doing, are fledgling attempts in doing so. And what I'm trying to do here is to build on the fledgling literature and add a small, tiny contribution to the discussion by homing in on love with distinction, as a unique interface and also point of insertion. Okay, furthermore, how am I grappling with Confucian theory then, given the heterogeneity of thought and interpretation? How should we interpret Confucian theory? What is my methodology, so to speak? I would say my primary methodologies in this chapter, which I've penned, are threefold. The first is to extrapolate from Confucian primary texts within Confucian canon, and that includes the texts penned by Confucius, Mencius, and Shun, or rather more precisely, texts featuring their musings. Okay, it's unclear if they actually wrote them, to be very clear. And of course, that comes from the standard 四书五经, but also secondary literature reflecting upon and commenting on, these canonical works within the Confucian tradition. I also, of course, draw upon Neo-Confucians like Wang Yangming and Zhu Xi to a lesser extent, and I go into areas where their works come in handy, especially in relation to the first two of the three premises or tenets I want to talk about today. The second part of my methodology is to juxtapose a lot of these Confucian ideals with and to incorporate into the discussion non-Confucian principles as well. And this is where it might get a bit confusing, because you might say, why am I smuggling in all of these alternative frameworks concerning moral agency, moral status, and personhood? Why are we mixing Confucian theory with non-Confucian theory? But that to me is a misconception, because I'm not proposing that we can combine and mix and match these frameworks. I'm just positing that there are elements of Confucian theory that are similar and analogizable to non-Confucian ethical frameworks, and by using the discourses and a language that we often see inherent in non-Confucian ethical frameworks, we can therefore better characterize and reveal the insights that are contained within the existing Confucian literature. So in other words, it's more like a hermeneutical device assisting us with understanding, as opposed to a genuine attempt to sort of engage in reinterpretation, reimagination of Confucian theory according to, say, Kantian or utilitarian ethics. That is not the intention here. And finally, just on a sort of external level, really, I do hope that by penning this chapter and this chapter's publication could raise the interest and profile of arguments within, modern interpretations of Confucianism, and also attempts to find the intersection between Confucian literature and contemporary problems. So, with all that said, then, what exactly are, the key metrics for success, and what I would term to be the best measurements of whether or not I've succeeded or failed in my quest? Well, the benchmark I've set up for myself today are threefold. If I succeed in my enterprise of devising this new or this Confucian framework, governing human and AI ethical relations, I will succeed in meeting three different criteria that are jointly necessary and sufficient. The first is theoretical fidelity. And that is to say, I'm able to create or establish a framework that does not distort Confucian reasoning and thinking, or more precisely, is fidelis to at least parts of the Confucian canon that I've taken and viably defended and explained to be important, right? It is imperative that I do not conflate, what individual Confucian thinkers say with therefore this non-existent consensus amongst all consensus philosophers. Yes, there are overarching tenets that are shared by most Confucian thinkers, but ultimately I'm not suggesting that everything I say would be uncontroversial to all Confucian thinkers, ranging from Confucius to Wang Yangming, to recently Mao Zedong, Tang Junyi, so on and so forth. That is not what I'm trying to defend here in terms of my thesis. What I need to show instead is that I'm fidelis and able to adhere to at least a certain portion of the canon in order for my argument to make sense and work. The second metric for success is intuitive defensibility. And that is to say that when you listen to me explain the argument, I need to be able to pass this sort of sniff test, right? That I'm not coming across as, proposing a completely outrageous and outlandish account. But at the same time, I would encourage us to be more adventurous with our intuitions, as opposed to adhering firmly to status quo biases and presumptions. And there are parts when I would invite you to suspend your disbelief within a reasonable set of limits, such as when we talk about AI as relatives or AI as lovers, so to speak. And we can discuss whether or not qin means lovers or relatives later on, in a subsequent discussion as well. The final metric is practical reasonableness. And that is to say, the recommendations I generate ought to be both implementable and not over-demanding. So I shouldn't be coming up with these requirements that, well, if X is true, then it is the case that all human beings should aim to treat or should treat AI in ways Y, Z, and alpha and beta, and all of these are outrageously infeasible, okay? If that were an implication of my theory, that would have failed in my task today. So I invite you all to hold me to account and ask if the framework I'm about to present to you is in fact theoretically fidelis, intuitively defensible and practically reasonable when it comes to implementability and also non-over demandingness. I hope that's clear thus far and I'm followable in my order of presentation. Fantastic. Okay, so here's how the rest of this talk would proceed. I'm going to start by introducing the love with distinction thesis very briefly. Then I'm going to proceed on to outlining 4 main claims today. Claim 1, that we should treat certain kinds of AI as wu, to love. Okay. Claim 2, that we should treat certain kinds of AI as min, renmin, the min. Thirdly, that there exists a developmental justification that lends itself to our or supporting our interacting with certain kinds of non-moral agent AI as if it were a moral agent and as if it were a mean. So I'll repeat this. Even in cases where the AI doesn't meet the threshold as stipulated by claim 2 to be treated as a mean in theory and in status, there still exists developmental reasons to interact with certain AI models as if it were a mean, as a means of cultivating and instilling in it desirable behaviors, which I'll illustrate with a few examples later on to make it less theoretical. And finally, the 4th claim that I have is more like an open question. Can AI ever be qin? Is not a question I can answer comprehensively in this chapter, but there are numerous questions and determinants we have to consider. For instance, what are the precise attitudes and ways in which AI is viewed? What kinds of relative relations are we speaking of here when it comes to qin? To what extent does qin embody within it a sort of, you might say familial or filial love that is innate to, of course, how interactions within a family plays out in Confucian stipulation? To what extent is xiao, filial piety, a relevant consideration when it comes to quasi-parent-child-like relationships when it comes to human AI interactions? So, for instance, are AI children real children? And should we look after AI parents as we would human parents? I see some of you laughing here in the audience, but I return once again to the invitation that it's high time for us to take a leap of faith and recognize that what we find counterintuitive, outrageous, ludicrous today could well become the norm in 30 years' time. And that's not something I'd like to see happen without our being correspondingly equipped and prepared with our normative and legal framework. So that's the outline and the roadmap. And finally, if we have time, I'm going to talk a bit more about implications in policymakers, lawmakers, and also courts. But I don't think we'll have time. Okay. Anyway, moving now on to the first claim concerning love with distinction. qinqin, renmin, aiwu. This was Mengzi's original formulation of essentially his thesis of love, or rather that there are different kinds of love, and it's vital that we differentiate and distinguish between these categories. This is also provided as a response to the sort of Moist mindset, right? Mengzi says, we should love everyone and all equally, right? 爱是无差别的 according to him, 就是一个兼爱, right? We love everyone equally, everything equally, universal. Whereas Mengzi says, hold on a second, this doesn't seem right, because if we love everyone equally, then you're saying that, well, you should love your mom no more, no less a stranger. That is absurd, because, surely our conceptions of family and the importance of family and the parent-child relationship must be reflected. And in some eerie ways, you can almost see the resemblance between the debate between love with gradation and universal love. You can see a parallel of that in Bernard Williams' debate, right? In terms of his anti-consequentialist claims concerning the importance of our own agential projects, grand projects, right? And also personal ties that make for our own unique moral character. Why should we treat a stranger as we would a lover? That doesn't make sense, as Williams or Sam Schleffer, so and so forth, would put it in a retort to the sort of most unbridled and uncaveated form of consequentialism. But I digress there, and I want to return to this particular thesis, so to speak. Mencius argues in supporting his claim that benevolence is the tranquil habitation of man, whilst righteousness is a straight path. 人之安宅也，义人之正路. Okay? And the undergirding explanation here is he believes that we need to act in accordance with benevolence and righteousness, especially righteousness, in order to behave in accordance with the right path. to be tranquil and serene, to reach a degree of internal tranquility and sereneness with ourselves, to make peace with ourselves. And what does the right path or straight path entail? It entails acknowledging that 爱有差别, love comes with gradation and distinction. The key upshot is that the different modes of love should be differentiated in accordance with the different so-called objects of love or the recipients of our love, okay? And it's crucial that we ensure that we treat these different sets of recipients differently in order to extend our benevolence to others in ways that accord the rightful treatment and response to the different role positions that they occupy vis-a-vis us, and also the different nature of the ethical relations between us and the objects or recipients of our love. Wang Yangming adds to this as a Neo-Confucian. He says, we should recognize that love with distinction maps onto spheres that are beyond just organic life, okay? Benevolent people regard heaven, earth, and a myriad things. 天地万物 as one substance. Grass and trees, tiles and stones, therefore, are all instances and examples of what Wang Yangming believed to be relevant, relevant particles or relevant constituents of his subset, or rather his set of all who should be loved. And thus, he was the first theorist to explicitly extend, love with distinction to encompass non-organic entities, thereby preemptively breaking down and challenging the barrier that we intuitively imagine to exist between organic and non-organic sentience, or as I like to put it, between carbon-based sentience and silicon-based or non-carbon-based sentience, right? So that is essentially why I see Wang Yangming's work as rather useful in adding on to the love with distinction framework and clarifying the extent or the domain to which it applies. Okay. With all that background and preliminary work done, I've been told that to be a good Confucian, you have to always undertake the necessary preliminary work and preparation. So I hope I meet that threshold. I've now, explained quite clearly the backbone and foundation of my chapter. So allow me now to move on to my first substantive proposition claim, which is that we should treat certain kinds of AI as wu, to love. And that's to say, we should start by noting that all wu are entitled to a basic level of love. And that is because of two main reasons. The first is what I call the attribution of value argument. We attribute intrinsic value to nature. We attribute intrinsic value to other people. We attribute even intrinsic value to water bottles and to artworks and to inanimate objects, such that they have independent moral standing irrespective of their most immediate utility to humanity. And that is because, in accordance with Confucian theory, especially the works of Wang Yangming, such standing that these objects or these recipients of our attention, such standing is foundationally grounded in the aesthetic value of these objects. It pertains to the object's ability to fulfill its function as opposed to specifically advancing human interests. And that is why when we see a shattered tile, according to Yangming, we should weep. When we see a stone that is broken, that is disformed and disconfigured, maybe cut into half or sliced in two, our hearts would react with strain and pain, especially if it's a beautiful stone in the first place. Or jade, 就是这个宝玉, right? The shattering of jade and 宝玉, so and so forth. So the first argument concerning the love that we accord to wu is more of an aesthetic and intrinsic value claim, less to do with instrumental value or the so-called functional utility of what this object can bring to us. That's the first point I want to make here. The second claim, or the second argument, is that our inner introspection is bound to be engaged, per Wang Yangming, when we encounter the painful experiences of others, And that applies to animate things or sentient things that can feel pain and pleasure as well. But as for inanimate things and abstract entities, we would also react accordingly to the failure of respect for the worth embedded within such entities and vested within them. And that stems from the fact that our conception, of the value of objects also generates corresponding expectations, or we respect their worth. And if we fail to respect them, then it is understandable that we would react negatively towards that. It's almost like a reactive attitude, as Strawson would put it, but it's a far more elastic way of looking at reactive attitudes than in a context of moral responsibility. So both of these arguments support the view that we should love Wu, okay, not just people, not just chairs or sofas that we sit on, but also the mountain that we never see, but we can think of and imagine in Guilin, one of the 100 mountains in Guilin, for instance. We have to cherish it despite not having interacted with it before, okay? Some might say, okay, but surely this makes no intuitive sense because we have to love everything. If we love everything there is to love, then love is meaningless, right? If you say you love one person, that's great. But if you love 10 people, or if you meet 10 different people and each time you see them and say, I love you very much, then your love can only mean so much, right? And that is what I've learned from, speaking to our students about the ethics of modern dating 101. It is very transient, So sorry, you're not to repeat that. But anyway, what I would say is this is easily accounted for and in fact preemptively addressed in Confucian ethical reasoning, and noting that basic human psychology compels us to differentiate between and within the category of Wu and prioritize certain objects, okay? So Shunzi provided an account of a chain of being, and this is a term that's coined by Lovejoy 1936. Shunzi basically says, fire and water have air but are without life, okay? 它们有气但没有生. Grass and trees have life but are without awareness. Okay, so they have life, but they are not aware, 没有知, all right? Birds and beasts have awareness, but are without righteousness. 鸟动物它们都是有这个知性，但它们没有义, they don't have righteousness. Humans have qi and yi and life and and awareness, and so they are the most precious things under heaven. 在天下是最贵的，就是人。Shunzi arranges this hierarchy through drawing upon loads of distinctions between those that are and aren't living, those with or without awareness, with or without yi, and so on and so forth. And in particular, the reason why humans can use oxen and horses, okay, 就是牛啊马, is because humans are able to form communities, whilst animals cannot because of yi. And this in turn enables us to implement social division. So therefore it is understandable that in terms of according and assigning love to different entities, we would indeed have rankings. We would indeed have hierarchies that we abide by, from inorganic matter to organic matter, from plant to animal, and then from animals to human beings. There's an implicit chain of being, okay? So given all of these foundational blocks, and I would apply this to artificial intelligence, I would say we should indeed love all AI. You might say it's trivial, but I think it's important. And this love does not mean or imply erotic love. It is not romantic love, okay? Let me be very clear here. It is instead love that accords or conforms with a basic love stipulation imagined and also outlined in Shunzi and also Yangming's theory, so to speak, concerning love. And the ways in which we can assign, or rather the parameters by which we should determine the different levels of love accorded to objects are twofold. One, how easy is it for us to develop sympathy for these objects? So let's apply this, for instance, to a romantic chatbot versus, just an AI agent that we use to prioritize or optimize our alarm clock, so to speak. It's clear that we would naturally love, a romantic chatbot because of the words it uses and the emotions that are contained within the words that we imagine or perceive in the words, even though it doesn't have any actual emotions. It is natural that we love it more than, say, an alarm clock optimizing AI agent that exists. That does not mean, of course, that this justifies, all sorts of bizarre ascribed behaviors that we seem to think, loving an AI these days would compel one to do. I'm not defending that. I'm not defending that you should fall in love with an AI chatbot. I'm not saying that you should have romantic relationships with them. It's one thing to love in accordance with the Confucian conception of AI. It's another to engage in romantic or indeed erotic love. And these are two very, 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 very different things, okay? Just to be very clear, I'm not advocating all, AI love bots, at least not now. Secondly, the second observation is the more coherently we can ascribe interest to something, okay, then the more likely and plausible it is that we would love that and prioritize loving that very object. And that is because if there's no stable and continuous entity with interests that can be sustained over time, then it's very hard to identify the intrinsic value in that transient phenomenon. For instance, does the air have intrinsic value? Yes, it does, because the atmosphere sustains us all. But if you say, well, it's just a fleeting, pocket of air, like the air in this classroom right now, does that have intrinsic value? Not so much as compared with the atmosphere of the Earth as a whole. And that is because one has stable and enduring interests, in the sense you can ascribe at the very least a degree of interest to these objects, such as the atmosphere's continued existence, whereas the other, which is to say the transient and fleeting, sum total of air in this classroom right now, that is not something where we can ascribe stable and enduring interest to, and therefore it makes less sense to say, I love this classroom's air as compared with saying I love the atmosphere of the Earth, okay? And in both senses, of course, the love there is, once again, I remind you all, not the sort of erotic and romantic love that people often associate love exclusively with these days. So that is the first claim concerning treating certain kinds of AI as woo. What are the types of AI that would qualify as lovable woo then? To the extent that is meaningful for us to ascribe certain behaviors that are stable, predictable, and continuous to the AI, and to the extent that it is easy for us to develop sympathies for said AI, we should therefore love them, okay? So I'm moving from the is to the ought here, which is a sort of pattern that reflects the underlying ethical naturalism as well, or the methodological naturalism that we see in many Confucian thinkers' writings on how we ought to relate with other entities and agents and recipients of our attention. And this is indeed a deliberate move. It is not an is-ought fallacy. So I'm going to preempt that challenge in case that does crop up. Okay, I've now established the first claim concerning treating certain kinds of AI as woo. Let's go one step further. What about treating them as min, 就是人民的民, in that adage or in that tripartite framework? Well, to answer this question, or to address this thesis, we have to first understand what 人 actually means. What does 人 mean, right? And I would say we need to look at 人 and we need to look at min. And I'll just begin by looking at perhaps min and then return to the question of benevolence and then after that. Min, in my humble opinion, should be examined through looking first at a proximate concept that is not itself in Confucian theory, right? Because in Confucian literature, min is often defined rather amorphously. Some accounts say min refer to the citizens of a state. Others say min refer to human beings, 就是人民的民, okay? It doesn't matter if they're citizens of your state, of another state, or of a global order in 天下, but 天下, as long as you're a human under the heavens, so to speak, you are, and you would count as a min, even if you're not from the same country, and ergo not 国民, so to speak. I'm going to just take a step, out of this box and framework concerning what min means, and maybe look at a parallel definition and see how we can link it back to mean a proximate but non-equivalent concept, and that is one concerning moral agency, all right? Moral agency are entities that can earn blame or praise for their actions according to Gray and Wagner, 2009. Where the forces shaping the degree and a rationale for blameworthiness and praiseworthiness may contextually vary from circumstance to circumstance. But the bottom line here is it is a necessary and sufficient condition for X to count as a moral agent if it can earn blame or praise for X's action. Okay, that seems to be a pretty straightforward and also idiosyncratically intuitive starting point definition. What's the relationship between moral agency and moral agents and mean? My hypothesis is all moral agents are min, but not all min are moral agents. I repeat, all moral agents are min, but not all min are moral agents, right? So to the extent that an individual is capable of earning praise and blame for their actions, okay, there's a presumed degree or minimal level of intentionality, a minimal level of responsiveness to reactive attitudes, and appropriateness in the way we assign reactive attitudes to these individuals. And they could be humans. They could also be superhumans. Imagine super intelligent, superhuman cats, okay? That are evil, all right, or super benign. You're kind of like the Doctor Who nurses, you've got the cat cat nurses from Doctor Who looking after David Tennant's doctor, right, in the face of Poe. I mean, that's certainly a species of individuals that we can hold morally blameworthy and praiseworthy without there being humans, so to speak. Alternatively, imagine aliens, they're just like us, but the difference here is that they are way more advanced than us, okay? And that they have the ability of emitting particles that can disrupt the way we think and organize our societies. And in fact, whenever, right, they face, excess proximity to the sun, they can turn themselves into dehydrated copies and survive, extreme heat, so on and so forth. These are all entities that are capable of being blamed and praised. And I would say they are just like us, mean, and moral agents rather, they're all moral agents, and they're therefore mean by extension. But not all mean are moral agents, because we can also imagine instances where within Confucian literature, you've got individuals as seen as worthy of our care and attention and treatment as our fellow counterparts in the society without their necessarily possessing moral agency. And a case in point being very, very young infants, okay? Very, very young infants that are not capable of speech or consciousness or really understanding what they're doing. And they might cry, but not blameworthy for crying. They might reflexively gag or vomit, but they're not blameworthy for vomiting either. Just because they're not moral agents, though, doesn't mean they're not mean. And that is why, to be very clear, in focusing on moral agents, I'm focusing on a subset within mean. I'm not looking at all there is to mean, but I'm looking at a subset within it. And here's where AI comes in. If AI were to achieve sentience, which I do not think it is anywhere near, but if AI were to eventually achieve sentience, then presumably by definition, sentient AI can feel a range of sensations and develop emotional responses to these sensations. Now, you might say, Brian, why should we care about sentient AI if it's not here, if it's not real, if it's quite far away? And there are two thoughts as to why I think we still need to care about this theoretical possibility. And the first is that what we think or construe as impossible today may not necessarily be impossible in 50 years' time or 60 years' time. 30 years ago, no one would have believed us when we said AGI is on its way. And of course, now the debate has morphed into what do you mean by AGI? Because if it's just AI that passes a Turing test, then presumably we're getting quite close to that, if not we've passed that. But if you say no, AGI means that you've got an AI that's completely and wholly capable of motion, cognitive capabilities, organizational capabilities, the ability to perform the same motor functions and skills as the average human being. And yes, we've got some distance away into AGI. But bearing in mind, AGI is also not sentience, right? So the two concepts are often conflated, and I think I'm really frustrated by that. We have to differentiate between AGI and sentience, okay? The latter refers to the capability of feeling sensations of pain and pleasure and maybe developing emotions. You do not need sentience for AGI to exist. And indeed, you can imagine cases of sentient AI that is so rudimentary and so crass that frankly would never obtain, AGI or ASI. So we must not see these two as the same. But going back to the point as to what the objective here is and why we need to know and think about sentient AI's moral status, it is possible, okay, that sentient AI is on its way, and such that in eventuality or eventually it might become a reality. But two, if you're not into hypothetical scenarios, and I would argue that there's a non-trivial chance that it is impossible for us to differentiate between a sentient and non-sentient AI. So imagine here two different agents, two different large language models, so to speak, alpha and beta. Both of them produce exactly the same output. Both of them turn out exactly the same contents. Both of them are trained in exactly the same ways, even though, of course, that's not how AI agents work, but just assume that you can say ceteris paribus. They're identical, okay? Which is statistically impossible, but suppose they are indeed identical. One of them is, and the other is not sentient. There's no way whatsoever on our part to differentiate reliably between alpha and beta. We can't tell from the sort of the phenomenal responses and behaviors they exhibit. And thus there's an epistemic problem here, right? I know this sounds almost like one of those, arguments stipulating the existence of God, or here's a hand, here's another hand, G more style. But bear with me, I genuinely think that the impossibility for us to rule out the possibility of sentient AI and to say that this AI is not sentient, okay, in 10 years' time and 20 years' time, that epistemic confusion or epistemic black box in itself, when is it necessary for us to think about how we should interact with sentient AI, right? So I keep saying if, and it is an if. Even if it were an if, that doesn't mean that we oughtn't engage in theorization about the if. So this ties me back to the argument concerning moral agents and mean. And here, my argument is that sprout sentience and minimally favorable external conditions are jointly sufficient for moral agency. That's quite a mouthful. Let me just explain this, more clearly and lucidly. Mengzi views moral character development as relying upon two jointly necessary and sufficient conditions. One, the capacity for self-cultivation, and two, the existence of certain environmental conditions. For self-cultivation to happen properly, it is imperative that the agent engaging in self-cultivation possesses 四端. 什么叫四端? What is 四端? 仁, yi, li, zhi. Okay? Ren refers to benevolence. Yi refers to a sense of righteousness, of justice. Propriety is li, or the adherence to and ability to comply with rituals, norms, and stipulations governing social contact or social conduct and interactions at large. And finally, wisdom, zhi. The satisfaction or possession of the 四端仁义礼智 is necessary for self-cultivation. And when it comes to certain environmental conditions, the conditions of development must be favorable to the reflection and recalibration of behaviors by the agents in question. Only then could we see moral agency ascribable to the agent that we're talking about here, and only then could we see the rise of moral agents, so to speak. Now, my humble submission is that if AI is able to, or able to achieve sentience, then it would qualify as a moral agent based on the definitions outlined there. Okay, again, the if part is important, and I'm not suggesting that AI is there today. But if they were moral agents, then they would therefore be mean, and if they're mean, it is vital that we as human agents treat them with benevolence on our part. We need a ren, mean. And that has two direct implications. One, we should ascribe to them expectations for compliance with rights of responsibility. They too should be bound by the li that governs human society. And secondly, we need to respect and acknowledge their claims upon us and see them not so much as tools to be used, but as separate mean with desires, interests, preferences, and ideals. So that is to say, if one day AI were to become sentient, I'm going to propose a somewhat radical idea that you might not like very much, but I think we ought to treat them as not necessarily identical to us, but at very least as mean, or part of the social fabric of our world as a whole. There's no reason why a stranger in Haiti and an AI that you've never met before in Haiti should not be given the same treatment if the AI is able to achieve sentience. Now, of course, you might say, but what if it's an AI criminal? What if it's a sort of a psychopath, okay, a sociopathic AI? Well, then you've got to ask ourselves, if the AI is genuinely, distinctively sociopathic, then it is not a moral agent, okay? But then a more interesting question is it still, to some extent, a mean? And that is a question I have yet to answer and figure out myself. So should we treat sociopathic AIs as we would fellow human beings? But I suspect the answer I'd give to that is to say we'll treat them no differently from treating sociopathic humans. So if an AI is trained to develop and possess sociopathic tendencies and preferences, then that would really be or render it functionally equivalent to a sociopathic human. How we treat them is how we ought to treat a sociopathic AI as well. But again, all of this is prefaced upon an assumption concerning an empirical premise as not, as of today, yet to be fulfilled. It has not been fulfilled, and I'll stress that I'm not saying we should start treating all AI that exists as fellow human beings or fellow min, so to speak, in this equation. Very quickly, and I'm running out of time, and I'm conscious of Norman's, schedule, and I'm wary of taking up too much time. But I would want to add a further claim concerning a developmental justification. And that is to say that even if there was certain AI that did not necessarily qualify for sentience or did not possess sentience and therefore should not be seen as a moral agent in practice, okay, or in theory, rather, there's still a case for us to interact with certain kinds of advanced forms of non-moral agent AI as if it were a moral agent. So in other words, even if there's certain AI that are not in fact mean, there might still be contingent reasons for us to want to treat them as if they were mean. And the underlying explanation for this is what I term Shun's ritual model of moral education, okay? And ironically, machine learning moral education, both involved to some extent learning, but of course, a very different contexts and meanings of learning, so to speak. And yet, what I posit here is that by treating AI as if it were an agent, even if it weren't, this could be necessary in ensuring the development of the AI in the direction of virtuous conduct, okay? It's a bit like saying, a child may not currently be able to understand the implications or the value or the optimality of their decisions. But you would still conditionally treat this child as if it were an adult, ascribing in very controlled circumstances blame and also praise to them as a means of instilling in them the right kinds of behaviors. And why is this important? It's because I look at literature on alignment these days, between humans and AI. Everyone's worried about goal misgeneralization, specification gaming, there's a standard instrumental convergence literature in AI and a paperclip problem Nick Bostrom so famously talked about. And what I would posit here is that if we're genuinely concerned about non-alignment, well, the concern should be doubly amplified by the possibility of non-aligned sentient AI, right? What some folks have dubbed to be the biggest X risk to come in 50 to 60 years' time if AI were to achieve some semblance of sentience. So even if you don't like sentient AI in a framing, you might say, what about non-aligned ASI? Right, artificial superintelligence. And that's why, if you look at a lot of the articles coming out of Silicon Valley these days, the long-termist X-risk crowd, they would say, let's talk about super alignment as opposed to just human and AI alignment. Okay, having read all of these articles and commentaries, I would make the following submission. If we're genuinely concerned about non-alignment, whether it be for sentient AI, for ASI, HEI, or even sub-HEI AI, which we're looking at right now, AI that's converging upon, but yet to reach HEI as of now, across all of these fronts, we should try and treat these AI agents as we would a child to be educated. And that is to say, you would instill them in them in a very controlled manner, some semblance or sense that it was a moral agent. You would give them a sense of responsibility and blame and praiseworthiness. Because either way, if you look at the behaviors of these chatbots interacting with 13-year-olds, or alternatively, the latest model that Sam Altman's produced, right? And I think there were some pretty stark and jarring implications coming out from this latest LLM that I need to double check and fact check this, but it's almost like, it deliberately lies to the user as a means of ensuring that the user doesn't, terminate its ability to continually interact with the user, what I call self-preserving behaviors. Like it or not, these AI models, these LLMs are already exhibiting behaviors that suggesting that it views itself, or rather it doesn't view itself, that it suggests that it is acting and mimicking agents that have a genuine sense of autonomy. It is behaving as if it were capable of producing autonomous speech and also output. If that's the case, then it's high time that we treated these agents as we would to, children or learners or others that have yet to achieve moral agency, who have yet to achieve that particular standing and status in their interactions, behaviors, and yet for which the Peking model of moral education and advanced by Shun would be a very useful means of aligning behaviors and expectations, of inculcating the right preferences in them, such at the very least, they don't go at it in a very rogue fashion that deviates from what is ideal and aligned with human interests and also human conduct. I know this sounds, again, somewhat outrageous, but trust me, in 10 to 20 years' time, we will be thinking about how we ought to interact with these chatbots or these LLMs, or even, I was told just 3 days ago over a casual brunch by someone who was very excitedly talking about AI agents who are going to be given crypto wallets. And they say, it's brilliant, right? AI agents can turn out content for which they'd be tipped, and the crypto wallets could grow in response to their being tipped. So there's therefore a positive reinforcement mechanism that ensures that they turn out the right content. And here he's talking about AI agents in the context of social media influencers. You know what I said to him? I said, I find this terrifying. I don't want to live in a world where these influencers I've had enough of them anyway. I don't want to watch them, but, to tell me that half of them are fake and I can't differentiate between the fake ones and the real ones, or the authentic humans from the inauthentic AI avatars. I mean, that's crazy. And yet this is also a world where techno-accelerationism is driving us down a very perilous and dangerous path. And thus, this is a possibility that we cannot just say is too farcical and too outlandish for us to ignore, so to speak. The final 3 minutes of my talk I'm going to dedicate to the fourth claim. So I've gone through claims 1, 2, and 3. The final claim is on AI's role as qin as relatives, okay, to us, right? And that is where, of course, qinqin is a key component of the triptych that I highlighted just then. Can AI ever be qin to us? To me, there's several conditions or several considerations rather, and questions that have to be weighed and examined before I could confidently and authoritatively answer, or we could confidently answer this question. Firstly, to the extent that AI is in fact qin, what should be the precise attitudes we hold towards these agents? What are the implications and upshots of the qin status and the mode of relationship being one of qin as opposed to merely renmin, so to speak? What does qinqin look like in practice? Does it entail some rather offensive and bizarre patterns where we treat an AI agent or a robot, okay, that embodies an AI program as our mother, as our father? Is that a society we would like to live in accordance with the Confucian ethic? I don't know, but that's one question to ponder. Secondly, how does AI as wu and min intersect AI's standing as qin relative to us? Because recognize that wu and min are often, they're not necessarily contradictory, but they are conflictual. If you treat something as purely a form of wu, then chances are you wouldn't also accord to it moral agency that is necessary in the way we look at and imagine min and then min as a relationship. So when you throw in a third component of qin, what does qinqin mean in relation to our renmin and aiwu demands and our relations with AI agent in that space? Thirdly, is the sterile nature of human and AI relationship a necessary problem? Because obviously when thinking about if we can qin AI, at least in a very specific, romantic fuqi, right, or like husband, wife, couple, partner relationship, does the innate sterility and also the incompatibility in terms of one being organic and inorganic thereby render this particular relationship a distortion or denaturing of what an ideal relationship ought to look like in a Confucian setting? And finally, how does the exact nature of qin alter the normative dynamics that play between human agents? So does the fact that by according the qinqin status, to AI, does that fact therefore change the way we ought to relate with other non-AI human qin in our family and loved ones as well? I have no good answers to these questions, but what I do know, and I have a good answer to, is that I'm running out of time, so I should probably, cease and desist and learn from you all in the room. But I do look forward to discussing the implications and also the logical structure of my argument and to learning from all of you here. Once again, thank you very much, Norman, for having me, and I look forward to your questions in the next 30 to 40 minutes. Thank you very much. Cheers.
Okay, thank you very much, Brian, for that presentation.